Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this morning on Facebook and YouTube. We really appreciate how so many of you have been liking and sharing our posts. Not only does that mean a lot to me and Lee, we also hope that these lessons and devotional thoughts are a blessing to the people who see what you've shared. So just want to say thank you again. We are nearing the end of our series, I Object, Why Some People Disbelieve. And after this week, we'll have one more question next week, and we'll wrap everything up the following week. This week, we're looking at another tough question. How could a loving God allow so much suffering? Now, throughout the last couple of months in this study, we've discussed several horrific instances of human suffering on both a personal and global scale. We've talked about the Holocaust, terrorism in Africa, the genocide of Muslims in Myanmar, and the ISIS slave trade, just to name a few. I remember a few weeks ago when I briefly told the story of a young lady named Nadia Murad who survived ISIS's slave trade. She survived being repeatedly raped and beaten and is now leading up an organization to help former enslaved persons start new lives. Many publicly prominent atheists today look at these kinds of atrocities and claim that there cannot be a loving God in control of things, otherwise there wouldn't be so much suffering in the world. Richard Dawkins, one of the so-called new atheists I've talked about before, says this: our universe, quote, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. For some, this is the single greatest argument against Christianity, specifically against the Christian claim that God is a loving God. Another way we could pose this question is this: how can the hypothesis of a loving, powerful God stand under the crushing weight of human distress? This is a good question to ask because suffering is real. Just look around you. And some people really struggle with the apparent tension between believing in a loving God on the one hand and understanding how there can be so much suffering in the world on the other hand. Now, like I said just a minute ago, a lot of people believe this is the linchpin argument against Christianity. God can't be loving because there's so much suffering. Here's the thing though. In my experience, and maybe in yours as well, when someone believes they have a simple slam dunk argument against Christianity, if we dig into their argument just a little bit, we see time after time that their argument isn't simple, it's simplistic. In other words, their argument doesn't take into sufficient account the complexity of what the Bible presents on a big topic like suffering. Instead of dealing with the issues at hand, then, people will often argue against a poorly represented, misunderstood version of Christianity. This is sometimes known as the straw man fallacy. We'll get into that a little bit later. So when we're talking about suffering, three of the most common ways to understand suffering available to people today are these. There's an atheist perspective, there's a Buddhist perspective, and a Christian perspective. Now we'll look at each of these this morning and we'll see how a Christian perspective stands out among the rest. For some atheists today, if you remove God from the equation of suffering, you don't have to be troubled any longer by trying to figure out if there's any meaning in your suffering. There isn't. So just get on with your life. Without God, without some ultimate purpose to our lives and our experiences, we are faced with bleak and utter meaninglessness. The best we can do then is to pretend to find something meaningful in our lives. But we shouldn't be surprised then when some people make others suffer. When people cause the suffering of others, they're simply mirroring the pitiless indifference of the environment around them. Politicized atheism of the 20th century in the Soviet Union and Communist China didn't alleviate suffering at all. Millions died last century, and China still has significant problems today. The meaninglessness of life, according to many publicly prominent atheists, simply doesn't allow us to have any ultimate meaning in our suffering. We simply suffer because the world is cruel and indifferent. That is, that's helpful for some people, but in the vast swaths of human history that has ultimately proved fruitless in dealing with the problem of suffering and truly understanding suffering. So another way that some people have used to approach suffering is from Buddhist perspectives. According to Buddhist traditions, the founder of Buddhism was once a prince in his early life, but eventually became disillusioned with the comforts and ease of palace life. He abandoned the palace and his family and traveled around for some time before experiencing spiritual enlightenment. Now known as the Buddha, or Enlightened One, he began to teach that life is suffering, and the way to escape the painful cycle of rebirth and reincarnation is to achieve the state of nirvana by breaking with the attachments that bind us to earthly life. Essentially, the Buddha taught that non-attachment, this notion of separating yourself from desires of any kind, is what can lead you to spiritual enlightenment and eventually escape from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Now, this idea of non-attachment might work for some folks, but think about the implications behind that. To love someone, anyone, is to be attached to them in some way. Think about your spouse or your parents, your siblings, your children, or anyone else you love. I can't help but find it painfully ironic that in order to eliminate the causes of suffering, the Buddha left his family, undoubtedly leading them to suffering. Ultimately, the path to the Buddha's version of enlightenment leads one to renounce so much of what makes life meaningful in the first place. And much of what makes life meaningful is the relationships we have with those we love. Now, we could spend weeks talking about suffering from philosophical and religious perspectives, but we simply don't have that kind of time, and a video class really isn't the best format for digging into deep and profound topics for extended periods of time. Honestly, I think a dozen videos of well over an hour or two each might help us scratch the surface. With that in mind, I've presented very briefly summarized versions of some atheistic and Buddhist understandings of sufferings, and I've tried to avoid giving simplistic answers. I've tried to give short answers, but not simplistic ones. But again, for the sake of our time this morning, I simply can't give the detailed descriptions that I would like to. Now, what I was just saying about a Buddhist perspective on suffering brings us to a Christian understanding of suffering. What I'm about to say isn't a simple answer, and I don't say this half-heartedly. Just a couple of weeks ago, I saw the suffering that a mother and grandmother faced when they buried their 34-year-old son and grandson. Their pain was real and raw, and Lee and I and several others did our best to walk with them in their pain. Familiar with suffering, and I would say to them what I'm about to say now. I think the story of Lazarus' resurrection in John chapter 11 gives us a good analogy for understanding suffering from a Christian perspective. Jesus heard that his friend Lazarus was sick, but instead of coming immediately and healing him, Jesus remained where he was for another few days. Lazarus eventually died, and then Jesus and his disciples make their way to his village where they meet Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters. Martha comes up to meet Jesus and flat out tells him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that God will give you whatever you ask." When Mary comes out later and meets Jesus, she basically tells him the same thing, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." In the course of his conversations with the sisters, Jesus tells them one of the most powerful and yet strangest things he could ever say in a situation like this. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." In these verses, Jesus says that life itself is found in him. When Jesus weeps at seeing Lazarus' tomb, it's clear that he is suffering with Mary and Martha and the rest of his family. Jesus has not detached himself from their suffering, Nor does he urge them to give up believing that there is any meaning in the world, as if that would alleviate their suffering. Jesus suffers and hurts and weeps with them. And by suffering with them, he draws Mary and Martha closer to him the source of life itself. In their suffering, Mary and Martha come to know Jesus unlike ever before. Now, I'm hesitant to say that suffering is good. Okay? I'm hesitant to say that suffering is good, but without question, I affirm that God can and does use suffering to do good, to bring about His good purposes in our lives. God uses the suffering we experience to draw us closer to Him and closer to our brothers and sisters in Christ with whom we suffer. Jesus is no stranger to suffering, and honestly, the Bible never promises a life without suffering. If I'm being honest, I think Christians can expect to suffer. But sometimes when we know the why, we have the will. I've seen Linnea give birth twice now. Both times were quite different in some ways, but both times were still painful. She suffered. She suffered. But because we knew why she was suffering, she had the will to push through. Perhaps, by way of analogy then, if we as believers in Jesus know why we suffer, we can have the will to endure suffering, suffering that draws us closer to God and closer to each other. Thank you.